Hello class, and welcome to lecture number 11 in Dr. Lewis's course on European history, 1500 to the present. Today we'll be covering aspects of tensions that went on in Europe during the Cold War that led to the pivotal events of 1989, including the fall of the Berlin Wall. Today's lecture will pick up where lecture number 10 left off, dealing with the aspect of nuclear weapons and how nuclear weapons impacted the early days and the development of the Cold War. In our second question, we'll explore how other nations turned away from American and Soviet leadership during the 1930s. Number 3, during the 1980s, we'll look at the impact that consumerism had upon European youth. And number 4, we'll deal with the complex aspects of what brought an end to communism in Europe, in particular, what triggered the downfall of the Soviet Union. From 1945 until 1949, the United States was the only nuclear power in the entire world. Due to espionage efforts, the Soviet Union was able to develop its own nuclear bomb in the year 1949, now kicking off an arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Not to be outdone by Soviet scientists, American scientists in November of 1952 tested a brand new nuclear weapon called the hydrogen bomb. If you compare the destructive capacity of the hydrogen bomb versus the nuclear bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. The bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki was equivalent to 40,000 pounds of dynamite being set off at the same time. The hydrogen bomb that was tested in 1952 was the equivalent of 20 million pounds of TNT being set off at the same time. Fearing now that the Americans would outdo them in this larger nuclear arms race, the Soviets pressured their scientists to also develop a hydrogen bomb, which they first tested in August of 1953, now setting humanity onto a new course that could potentially lead to the destruction of all human beings. To try and offset this new dynamic, in 1958 the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, the former Grand Coalition of World War II, came together and signed a test ban treaty, arguing that none of these three powers would test out new developments in nuclear weapons. Now that a ban had been put on to testing, politicians and military leaders started embracing a new concept called MAD. MAD being an acronym that stood for Mutually Assured Destruction. The idea now being that if each side would develop as many bombs as humanly possible, that no side would ever be crazy enough to utilize a nuclear weapon. In 1959, since American scientists were now being hemmed in by international treaties that prevented them from further testing of types of nuclear weapons, scientists now started developing new delivery systems for nuclear weapons. First and foremost, in 1959, the Polaris nuclear submarine was launched by the United States. This was a machine that could run underwater undetected by an enemy and launch enough nuclear weapons from underneath the oceans to wipe out entire regions in the Soviet Union. To take this a step further, the United States also developed intercontinental ballistic missiles. These missiles, now tipped with nuclear warheads, had the ability to now shoot from one continent to another. Prior to this, if one wanted to deliver a nuclear missile, one had to actually fly a plane over your target and drop the bomb from an airplane. Now with the intercontinental ballistic missiles, nations had the ability to launch nuclear weapons from one side of the earth and to hit the other. In 1960, if you compare the number of bombs the United States had versus the Soviet Union, the United States had 18,638 nuclear weapons compared to 1,605 bombs on the side of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were fearful that this disparity between the numbers in nuclear weapons could potentially lead to the destruction of the Soviet Union in the future. In two different initiatives in 1961, the Soviet Union reacted to this nuclear disparity with the United States. Number one, as a symbol of the Cold War, the Soviets built a wall through the entirety of the German capital city of Berlin. The Berlin Wall now became a symbolic gesture, cutting off the West from the East in international relations. Just 1 month later, 2 months later, in October of 1961, The Soviet Union tested out the largest nuclear weapon humanity has ever known. The Big John weapon that was tested out in northern areas of Siberia equaled 116 quadrillion pounds of TNT. The reason why the Soviets tested out the Big John device was to try and scare the Americans that any pursuit of a nuclear arms race in the future would inevitably lead to the destruction of humanity, hoping that in this scenario that Americans would now back off with mad theory and sign a number of not just test ban treaties with the Soviet Union, but treaties actually beginning the process of outlawing nuclear weapons and dismantling nuclear arsenals. Starting in the early 1960s, the Cold War had triggered a scenario where enough nuclear weapons existed to potentially wipe out all of humanity. In the early 1970s, a couple of other trends came into place that threatened to destabilize the entirety of the world politic when it came to the Cold War. What this involved was both the Soviet Union and the United States now arguing that if the economic system that existed in other nations that were allied to them was threatened in any way, shape, or form, that the United States and the Soviet Union had the right to military intervention or assassination to protect the own economic system that they promoted during the Cold War. On August 21, 1968, when a reformist government came into power in the communist nation of Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union launched a military invasion, arguing that socialism was being threatened in Czechoslovakia, and they installed a non-reformist government in power that stayed in power until the year 1989. On September 11, 1973, reacting to the democratic election of a socialist named Salvador Allende to the South American nation of Chile, the United States argued that Salvador Allende threatened the very existence of capitalism throughout the entirety of South America and needed to be stopped. What the United States did was they helped promote and got themselves involved in an assassination plot that killed off Salvador Allende on September 11th, now installing a new dictator by the last name of Pinochet, who stayed in power in Chile from 1973 until 1990. To complicate matters even more, things started heating up in the early 1970s in the Middle East surrounding the nation of Israel. In October of 1973, Israel's very existence was threatened by its Arab nations. During the Yom Kippur War, Israel and Arab nations went to war with each other, and the only thing that saved Israel from being destroyed during the Yom Kippur War was assistance by the United States. The United States essentially provided Israel with the top military technology that existed in the world and provided them with intelligence to spy upon their Arab neighbors, thus ensuring that Israel survived. For the fact that Israel's enemies could not find a way to punish the United States militarily for saving the nation of Israel, they decided to use an economic embargo instead. OPEC, which stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, put an embargo upon the United States, refusing now to sell the United States oil. And by the end of 1974, the United States had been only paying $3 a barrel for oil, and the price now quadrupled to $11.65. What this triggered was absolute economic devastation in the American industrial economy. For the fact that almost all modern consumer goods are based on plastic, and that plastic is a petroleum-based product, this now meant that the price of producing plastic products in the United States quadrupled after the Yom Kippur War. This also meant that the cost of transporting goods across the United States due to gas shortages also had a crippling effect on the economy. What President Richard Nixon decided to do in reaction to this, through his later support by President Ford as well, was to start the process of exporting American manufacturing to the communist nation of China, because China was not impacted by OPEC embargoes, and China also had some of the cheapest labor resources in the entire world. What this meant for the Soviet Union was the Soviets now identified that their own oil resources were an incredibly precious commodity on world economy, and that the OPEC embargo might actually help to promote economic growth in the Soviet Union. Looking at this phenomenon of assassination, regime change, and energy crisis, more and more nations throughout the world, particularly in Europe, started asking the question, can either the United States or the Soviet Union be resisted in international affairs, or were these two superpowers destined to define the politics of the entire world? While many Europeans became increasingly critical of American and Soviet leadership during the 1960s and the 1970s, the first region that provided any major resistance to Cold War domination was not Europe, but the Middle East. In 1979, an Islamic Revolution gripped the nation of Iran, ousting a political dictator who went by the title of the Shah and bringing in a religious leader as the new dictator, a man who went by the title of the Ayatollah Khomeini. What helped to trigger this revolution in Iran was that in 1953, Iran had been a free and independent democratic republic. It's just that the Iranian people had elected to power a man by the name of Dr. Mossadegh, who threatened to nationalize the oil resources of Iran. To protect American and British investments in Iranian oil, the CIA and the MI5 participated in the overthrow of Dr. Mossadegh's democratically elected regime and started the process of installing a dictator who went by the title of the Shah. Due to the fact that their elections had been rigged by outside forces, for several decades, Iranian people became more and more angered by dynamics of the Cold War. In 1978, there was a referendum within Iran asking the Iranian people if they would like to continue on under the leadership of the Shah or if they would like to institute a new form of government. At the time, the Shah was in the United States visiting the American president, Jimmy Carter, when news came of this referendum that the Iranian people did not want the Shah back. The Shah stayed here in the United States as a political refugee, opening up a political vacuum in Iran where the religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini came to power. In terms of the Cold War, the Ayatollah Khomeini promoted a very, very radical notion where he said neither East nor West, but Islam. He said it was now the holy role of Muslims emanating out of the Middle East to struggle against injustice by utilizing martyrdom. Essentially that if a Muslim was struggling against the injustices of the world and gave their life in that struggle, that they would automatically go to heaven. What happened more and more starting in 1979 is that terrorism started coming forward in international politics as a tool and a methodology for non-dominant powers in the world to struggle against the superpowers of the world. Essentially, the Ayatollah Khomeini was considered enemy number one in international politics by both the Americans and the Soviets. As global politics became increasingly complicated in the late 1970s, youth culture became more and more depoliticized. Initially in the late 70s, there was great hope of young people getting more involved in politics and activism through the medium of punk rock and hip-hop culture. Both punk and hip-hop spawned out of urban cities in the United States of young people reacting to the outsourcing of jobs, the lowering of national incomes and standards, and essentially the destruction of what many people had dubbed the American dream. What kept punks and hip-hop artists in a common bond with each other was an anger that their future had been taken away from them. What helped to offset this politicized youth movement was the rise of what historians have unlovingly dubbed the me, me, me generation. The young people of the United States and spreading throughout Europe started embracing in the early 1980s a new pop culture centered on music, video games, and essentially about that life should be about fun, not about politics. This new youth consumerism was developed and spread by the creation of the first home video gaming system called the Atari. This culture was further propagated on cable television through the development of a new channel called MTV. Prior to the rise of things such as reality shows, there was a time that MTV played 24 hours a day music videos, spreading out the images and ideas of a brand new consumeristic youth culture. In terms of the movies, the world became very simplified for young people in the 1980s through movies such as Star Wars. Star Wars showed a simple world of good versus evil, right versus wrong, that inspired political leaders such as Ronald Reagan to create anti-communist programs that were also called Star Wars, essentially starting to see the lines between reality and between pop culture starting to blur. What the music and the movies and the consumerism promoted within young people at the time was a complete rejection of politics, and that young people should be the dominant voice of the world as an apolitical voice, focused in on fun, excitement, and individualism. Essentially, that the world should be about me, me, and me. Hence the me, me, me generation. As young people increasingly rejected politics, two political leaders rose up in this political void with very little opposition: Ronald Reagan and the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. The two of them coming together in an alliance between the United States and Great Britain to take on what they called the evil empire of the Soviet Union. In terms of what inspired both Thatcher and Reagan was an Austrian economist by the name of Friedrich Hayek. In 1951, Friedrich Hayek had written an influential economic treatise called The Path to Serfdom. What Friedrich Hayek argued was that while government programs on paper looked like good and positive things for society, that in reality they were creating a culture of dependency that would ultimately undermine and destroy free market economies. Friedrich Hayek argued that the only way to bring an end to this path to serfdom was, number one, for governments to completely cut social spending, number two, also for governments to intentionally raise up unemployment rates, arguing that if workers no longer felt that they had any type of job security, that they would be happier with the jobs that they had, they would work harder, and they would complain less, and therefore be more productive and increase the strength of market economies. What Thatcher and Reagan also did as conservative politicians was rejected the previous 30 years of economic policies when it came to government, where governments had embraced the ideas of big government programs and paying for them through taxes. Thatcher and Reagan argued that through the process of tax cuts, by giving wealthy people more and more money, that wealthy people would reinvest this money in their economies, create jobs, and the wealth would quote-unquote trickle down and create prosperity for all people. What we're going to see in terms of foreign policy is both Thatcher and Reagan argued that the Soviet Union represented an evil empire, and that Britain and America together represented goodness in the world, and that one could not simply live side by side and in peace with evil with the world, but the Americans and the British should unify together in a joint effort to destroy communism. What they argued was the best way to do this was to expand out a military arms race between the East and the West once again. What both Thatcher and Reagan had recognized was that military budgets, at least over a short-term period, stimulate capitalist economies, create jobs, and create new technologies, while military spending bankrupted socialist economies. Socialist economies, on their most basic principles, a socialist government is supposed to provide healthcare, housing, education, and jobs for all citizens who live under that system. That means every time that government has to spend money on a missile, or on a tank, or on a gun, that's money that's being taken away from these larger social and economic programs. Essentially, the idea being that if you heated up the arms race long enough, that this would promote growth in capitalist economies and ultimately destroy communist economies. One of the reasons why Thatcher and Reagan had such a hard time relating to the Soviet Union was during the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was an incredibly unstable place. In November of 1982, the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, after being in power for almost 15 years, died. When Brezhnev died, he was replaced by a man in his early 80s by the name of Andropov. After only several months of being in power, Premier Andropov dropped off and died. Andropov was then replaced by an individual who was in his late 70s by the name of Chernenko. Chernenko, being an old man, died in March of 1985. And suddenly the Soviets came to some common sense and put a man in who was only 53 years old, a new leader by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev. The great question coming up to Gorbachev's rise to power in the mid-80s for Reagan and for Thatcher, and looking at the Soviet government, was asking the question, who can be trusted if we actually sit down and negotiate with these people? Both of these people thought the communists were evil, and for the fact that communist leaders were changing all the time, they didn't even know who was in charge. That is, until the rise of Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 with a simple proposition, that something had gone wrong in the 20th century, and that it was up to him to set things straight. Number one, he argued that the idea of dictatorship and about oppression were completely foreign to what the ideals had been of the Soviet Revolution of 1917. He said that this new Soviet government that had been inspired by ideas of Karl Marx was supposed to be about equality, socialism, and democracy, not dictatorship and oppression. He said for the fact that the Soviets had been constantly threatened by the outside world, that these democratic institutions had never had a chance to develop. He argued then that if he could establish a new aspect of peace in international relations, that the Soviet Union could now flourish into the democratic nation that its founders had intended. The first policy they pursued is the policy of perestroika, which translates roughly to restructuring. He argued that officials in the Soviet government had far too much power over the individuals' lives because they were not just political officials, but they were also in charge of the economic life of the entire nation. He said that many of these people had become corrupt and had essentially become career politicians who were not representing the interests of the Soviet people. And as we'd say in modern times, under the politics of Trump, there was now time to drain the swamp. Essentially, shake things up and get rid of people who had been in positions of power for too long. The other idea is he said that communism needed to borrow a few ideas from their capitalist counterparts, in particular to overcome the gap between the price of a consumer product and how much it actually cost the government to produce that. It used to be in the old Soviet economy, if you went to a grocery store, number one, that store was owned by the government. Number two, the things produced in that store had been produced by the government, and that the employees who worked at that store were also employees of the government. So when you went to your local grocery store, not only was the government in control of everything, but that gallon of milk that you go to buy would cost the equivalent of maybe 20 cents. Essentially, they would make sure to keep commodities incredibly cheap so that all Soviet people could afford them if they were available. The problem is that gallon of milk that they were charging 20 cents for could have possibly cost the Soviet government several dollars to produce. What Mikhail Gorbachev said is that essentially market mechanisms need to be introduced into the socialist economy so that the price of consumer goods was actually pegged to the cost it was for the government to produce these goods. He also argued for a policy of glasnost to try and bring an end to tensions with the United States. Number one, Mikhail Gorbachev despised nuclear weapons and thought they were the greatest threat that humanity had ever known in its existence. In order to reduce tensions with the West, he said that if Ronald Reagan was willing to sign a number of treaties with him, that not only would he not test any more nuclear weapons, but he was willing on his time as political leader of the Soviet Union to get rid of all nuclear weapons. Initially, when Ronald Reagan heard this, he thought this was a bit of a ludicrous idea, that such a thing would never happen. By the end of the Reagan administration, both Reagan and Gorbachev dedicated our countries mutually to the idea that within a generation, all nuclear weapons would be destroyed. Number two, for the fact that the Soviet Union had gotten bogged down in a brutal jihadi war in Afghanistan, he said, if this is a source of tension throughout the world, we'll pull our troops out of Afghanistan and we'll stop meddling in the politics of the Middle East. He also said that much of the problems between East and West were based upon not having access to information on each other and essentially shared misperceptions. He said, number one, internally, he said that the Soviet people needed to be open to talk about ideas, to accept new ideas, and to encourage debate within Soviet society about the real problems that were facing the country. He also argued that American people and Russian people actually had quite a bit in common, but they perceived each other very differently because they very rarely saw images of each other. Upon coming to power, Mikhail Gorbachev started making initiatives inviting American journalists to come and cover what life was like in the Soviet Union, and for Soviet journalists to travel to the United States to cover what life was like for common people, hoping that through such media initiatives, the American and Soviet people would realize that they had far more in common than they had different. Essentially, what Gorbachev argued was that the tensions of the Cold War could be brought to an end by facilitating a national unity and international unity based upon the common values they held with each other instead of focusing upon our differences. Mikhail Gorbachev sincerely believed that propping up East European communist regimes had become more of a liability to the Soviet Union than a help to Soviet national security. The very first thing that Mikhail Gorbachev did was he revoked the Brezhnev doctrine of earlier years, saying that if East European nations wanted to change their systems around, that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene. What this culminated in was a number of East European nations starting to lift travel restrictions between each other and between the West. What began to occur was more and more East Europeans traveling to the West and seeing different consumer goods such as video cassette recorders, BMX bikes, and being exposed to Hollywood culture of the me generation. What happened more and more was VHS tapes started getting bootlegged in Western Europe, smuggled back into Eastern Europe, and introducing East European youth to a world they never dreamed even existed. What occurred more and more was essentially young East Europeans bugging their parents to get involved in politics so that they could have access to more movies, more gadgets, and more toys. The reality of what's going to occur here in Eastern Europe is while the end of communism is going to help to facilitate many of those things, it's also going to bring an entire decade of crisis of both economic and cultural decay. The first time I got a chance to meet a woman who had grown up in the Soviet Union, I met her in Chicago during the 1990s. I asked her what she thought about political reform going on in the former Soviet Union. She replied back and said, "It's great. People are free to talk in the streets." But they're living in the streets now, too. Essentially arguing that things went too far too quickly and that this new consumerism that had promised so much to people in Eastern Europe, that without jobs and without security, that many people were not able to tap into these new consumerist freedoms. In 1989, a phenomenon of political change occurred throughout Eastern Europe that historians dubbed at the time the Velvet Revolution. Essentially, the transition out of communism outside of the East European nation of Yugoslavia was for the most part a very peaceful process. Throughout 1989, what occurred more and more was adults going out into the streets and protesting against the government, calling for reforms, particularly calling for more access of adults in the East to be able to travel to the West to buy consumer goods for their me kids. Initially, communist governments resisted these public protests and would send the police out to try and break up protesters. What started occurring during the summer of 1989 was oftentimes when police and military were sent out to break up protests, is instead of breaking up the protests, police and military officials joined in with the protesters, calling for change and calling for reform. What this culminated in is on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall started coming down. Essentially, protesters who believed that the gates between East and West Berlin would be opened up and that German people would be free to travel back and forth, decided to take matters into their own hands on the morning of November 9th and showed up to the Berlin Wall with sledgehammers and started systematically dismantling the symbol of the Cold War. What began immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall was a call within Germany for a reunification of East Germany with West Germany, creating a new united Germany that could lead as a dominator of the European peoples. What many Americans fail to understand about the process of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe is that communism in East European nations outside of the Soviet Union was something that had been imposed upon them by outside forces after World War II. Communism within the Soviet Union was a product of the wishes and historical aspirations of the Russian people that had culminated in their own revolution in 1917, which meant that the Russians did not think of communism as an outside force coming in to oppress them, but was a product of their own political heritage. What occurred after the collapse of communism in 1989 in other East European nations was Mikhail Gorbachev began a process of decentralizing power from Moscow, essentially allowing smaller republics throughout the Soviet Union to have more autonomy and more independence. What he also did was empowered the Russian people to decide the fate and future of their nation. In March of 1991, there was a vote on national unity throughout the Soviet Union, asking the Soviet people if they would like the Soviet Union to continue on in its current structure, and if they would like the Soviet Union to continue being communist. And almost 90% of the nation voted yes. So if the Russian people still supported the idea of the Soviet Union staying communist, we have to ask ourselves the question, what on earth happened in 1991 that brought an end to the Soviet Union? To look at the details of what occurred, we need to understand something about the relationship between Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev. While Mikhail Gorbachev was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin was a permanent thorn in his side. In many ways, this would be like the relationship nowadays between somebody like Hillary Clinton and somebody like President Donald Trump. These two individuals, as we all well know in American politics, despise each other, and they stand for essentially opposites on almost every issue, and in public, they're always fighting. This was the same relationship that Boris Yeltsin had with Mikhail Gorbachev. What occurred in August of 1991 is while Mikhail Gorbachev was on vacation, a coup d'etat happened in the Soviet capital of Moscow, where the Russian Red Army said that Mikhail Gorbachev had fallen ill and that a new government would be coming to power. Boris Yeltsin then took to the streets, particularly in front of journalists from the brand new 24-hour news network, CNN, having public protests and calling for the return of Mikhail Gorbachev, saying that this was simply a coup and that the Russian people loved Mikhail Gorbachev and that Mikhail needed to be brought back to power. To give an American aspect of this would be like a coup d'etat happening against President Trump and Hillary Clinton taking to the streets and getting on CNN saying, "We all love President Trump. You should bring him back to power. Something's gone wrong here." When the Russian people saw Boris Yeltsin calling for the return of Mikhail Gorbachev, they knew something funny was going on, just as Americans seeing Hillary Clinton come to the aid of Donald Trump would also say something funny is going on. And something funny was going on. What occurred is, since Boris Yeltsin manipulated the international media, because nobody really knew much about this guy internationally, is that leaders of the Russian Red Army realized this coup d'etat was not going to work, and they brought Mikhail Gorbachev back to power. What Boris Yeltsin did over the next couple of months is he began a systematic process of blackmailing Mikhail Gorbachev, putting threats upon his life and saying that if Mikhail Gorbachev did not follow exactly what Boris Yeltsin said, they would make sure that Mikhail Gorbachev disappeared for all time. Without any votes and without any previous warning, on the evening of Christmas Eve, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev got onto Soviet national media and made an announcement to the Soviet people that when they woke up on Christmas morning, that the Soviet Union would be dissolved and would no longer exist. After making this pronouncement, Mikhail Gorbachev fled the nation because his life was being threatened, and the Soviet Union came to an end, and Boris Yeltsin, who was essentially the political arm of the Russian mafia, came to power. So we have to ask ourselves, in the Russian experience, what brought an end to the Soviet Union? Was it a sort of democratic-style revolution, as we saw in the streets of Eastern Europe in 1989? Or was it coercion, blackmail, and media manipulation that brought the downfall of Mikhail Gorbachev and brought the rise of Boris Yeltsin? What we'll look at in our next lecture is some of the developments of the European Union at these same times to understand something about the nature of Europe after the end of the Cold War.